Good evening, everyone, and good morning to Professor Dani Rodrik and to our participants from the other side of the world, of the globe. And welcome to the third seminar of our society, the Society for the Analysis of Government and Economics. And let me very briefly explain what we are as a SAGE, S-A-G-E. Sage, of course, in English means ancient, usually ancient and wise person, whether it's a man or woman, okay? But in this particular case, the sage represents the Society for the Analysis of Government and Economics. So the keyword is government and economics. Government and economics is a new emerging area of economic research. And in one sentence, I can explain what government and economics is about. In short, government and economics believes that government should be featured in almost all economic analysis. Government should be featured as an active participant in almost all economic analysis. Why? Because in our world, the government is already a super active player. Let's do not pretend that they do not exist. It is a reality, it's a fact. So that our economic research has to come to this reality, right? Come to realize to this reality. We have to put back the role of the government, okay? And then in order to understand the role of the government, we have to understand the organization, the incentives, and the politics behind the behavior of the government. That's the central idea of the field, government and economics. And I'm very happy to report to all of our audience that Professor Eric Masking of Harvard University and I, as co-presidents, we have been working hard and we have been editing a new journal, Journal of Government and Economics. And our society, the SAGE, has recently been accepted as a member of the International Association, International Economic Association, IEA, International Economic Association. And what is IEA? Okay, we have a best person to explain what IEA is. Okay, who is our speaker of the day? Okay, Professor Dani Rodrik. Okay, Professor Dani Rodrik is world's leading expert on international trade, on economic development, and also on comparing experiences of various countries in economic success or economic failure. So he's one of the most widely read academic economists, without any exaggeration. He's one of the widely read academic economists. He's able to cut across two fields, two different worlds, the academic world of economists and those non-academic world. So we're extremely happy, we're honored to have Professor Dani Rodrik to talk about the topic of how to manage U.S. China economic potential conflict. Maybe it's already in conflict, depending on what the divide. Okay, so please, Professor Dani Rodrik, you may also explain what IEA is about. Thank you very much again. Thank you for agreeing to come to us. Thank you. Dani, please.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be with you and with this audience. The International Economic Association, which I'm proud to preside over currently, is really the only network of global network for economists, and for those of you who are interested in its activities, and we have a bunch of different things going on, I would suggest that you go to our website, IEA-world.org. But if you just Google International Economic Association, you would find our website. We're doing a lot of things, including around the theme of diversifying economics globally, which is to which is trying to improve and enhance access by researchers, particularly young researchers and women researchers around the world that might not be based in the United States or Europe, or where there is already very thriving research communities, but trying to enhance access to researchers from around the world to global networks and publications. And so I would suggest that you check our website for a bunch of activities. But on to now to the topic of today, which is the important topic of managing U.S. China conflict. Let me see if I can turn this into a slideshow. I am much less familiar with the discussion or debates in China around this question, although I imagine it's a question that preoccupies both the academic community as well as the government. But in the context of the United States, there's been a remarkable change in the overall frame of mind and attitudes toward China in the last few years. And here I have a quote from a very distinguished scholar of international relations, John Mearsheimer, from the University of Chicago, from an article that has just appeared on Foreign Affairs, which states in a rather striking and dramatic fashion a kind of an emerging consensus, if you will, that is growing in the United States about the inevitability of conflict, and this is a rather striking passage where John says, all great powers, be they democracies or not, have little choice but to compete for power in what is at root a zero-sum game. This logic has motivated both superpowers during Cold War, explains why Beijing is pursuing regional hegemony, why it would do so even if it were a democracy. It also explains why American leaders are now determined to contain China. Structure, that is to say, the global structure of power competition, is the main driving force behind this rivalry. And then the kicker, which is why American leaders should never have helped China grow wealthy. Quite a remarkable statement. And this is from a very, very serious, very well-recognized scholar of international relations. Now, we economists, of course, tend to think of the world not in zero-sum terms, but much more in positive-sum terms. But I think this throws a challenge to us as to how we can actually think about a world in which US and China can coexist, can reap the gains from cooperation, while also understanding that there are many different areas in which there are going to be significant differences of view, significant competition, and power competition and geostrategic competition and conflict, and that we manage those conflicts without necessarily eliminating the possibilities of gainful or mutual cooperation where those gains exist. So I'm going to present an argument that is built on a number of building blocks that have been fleshed out much more in various pieces of writing. So I will refer to those other pieces for many of the details of the argument. But the first building block of the argument is that a very light veneer of global governance for most issues around the world is actually not necessarily a bad thing. So global governance light is okay. The healthy global economy requires a lot less agreement on international rules and global governance than is usually presumed. That's going to be, I'm going to spend a lot of time on this because it's really the economic core of the argument. That's going to lead me to sort of a kind of a more, sort of what does that imply for US-China relations? And I'll argue that it's possible to envisage a system of what I would call peaceful economic coexistence between the US and China. And here I will draw on a kind of a structured framework for managing economic conflict, which a variety of colleagues and I first put together in this U.S. China Trade Policy Working Group, where we enunciated this framework in 2019. Eric Maskin, which David mentioned, was actually part of the working group and one of the signatories to this. And with in more recent work with another international relations scholar, my colleague Steve Walt, we've built on this framework to extend it to a kind of a broader set of global relationship that go beyond the economic into geopolitics and everything from competition in the nuclear domain to regional competition, and where we argue that the same kinds of principles can be applied to these broader geopolitical and national security issues as well, to envisage a more stable and peaceful global political order than that's been sketched out in the quote that I started with. Okay, so so let me try to build on the first part of the argument with regard to global governance. And here my foil would be sort of, quotes of like this, where, that, when, you turn around and everywhere there's this argument that, we're at a time when we need more global governance, that in the words of Nimat Shafik, that what happens anywhere affects everybody, increasingly so. So it's pretty clear that the worlds need more, not less, international coordination and cooperation. So this argument has now been lodged in our mind that we, in an interdependent world, we need ever increasing global cooperation and therefore stronger global governance. The question I want to ask is, what is, in fact, sort of going back to first principles, what is the appropriate scope for global economic governance? What's the dividing line between economic policies that should be governed globally versus nationally? When do we need actually international rules? So the kind of quote that I used from Nimat Shafik suggests that whenever there is economic interdependence and therefore spillovers across borders, that we would have an argument for global rules or global economic governance. But when we think about sort of the actual world and how it operates, in fact, the number of policy domains where we have these cross-border spillovers is extremely large. In fact, everything that you do domestically has in some way or another going to have an effect on countries somewhere else. So think about your educational policies. Your investment in human capital will shape your factor proportions. It will shape your comparative advantage, and therefore will shape how you're competing with other countries. And if you invest in human capital and develop a stronger comparative advantage in human capital intensive goods, you're going to have adverse effects on the comparative advantage of other countries that you're competing with in such goods. If your highway speed limits are going to affect the price of oil on world markets, and therefore is going to affect the interests of oil exporters, similarly with gasoline taxes. And then we move on to kinds of domains where we, like agricultural subsidies or import tariffs on autos or tax havens, where we understand much more intuitively, of course, these are policies with cross-border spillovers, and that there is increasingly a presumption of some kind of global discipline, although we don't necessarily think of that we should have global governance or global rules on gasoline taxation or domestic highway speed limits or educational policies at the national or subnational level. But it's not at all clear where, in fact, and why we're drawing these lines. Is it the presence or the magnitudes of cross-border spillovers? It's not at all clear that your educational policies, your highway speed limits, your gasoline taxes have necessarily less of an impact than your agricultural subsidies. Is it that, the existence of harm, that it's not just spillovers, but that those spillovers are adverse? Well, actually, it's not clear, because agricultural subsidies, which are part of international trade rules, in fact, in general, produce benefits to the rest of the world, to the extent that you're subsidizing your exports, you're reducing agricultural prices for the rest of the world. So on balance, as every economist knows, an export subsidy is actually a net gift to the rest of the world. Is the objective of policy domestic versus international? Or is that where we're drawing the line? That maybe if the objective of policy is international, that's where it should be governed by international rules. Once again, I don't think there is such a clear principle in operation, because many agricultural subsidies are motivated by domestic social and environmental or regional concerns, and not by international economic concerns. So I don't think in the way that we organize the world, and where we have actual governance, and where we push where we invest in global governance, really lines up in any natural way with sort of first order principles or reasoned principles about where we should have global governance and international rules, and where we should not. And the fact of just spillovers in interdependence doesn't give us a very good guideline. So what does actually economics tells us? If we look at the world economy from the lens of standard economic principles, I think the first thing to realize is that in international economics, virtue is generally its own reward. That is to say, pursuing policies that are generally good for the national economy are also good for the global economy as a whole. After all, when we teach comparative advantage and the gains from trade, we spend a lot of time in the classroom trying to convince our student that in fact free trade expands national welfare in quotation marks, and I'll come back to that in a second. Similarly, world of open capital flows is supposed to be primarily beneficial at home. So the primary arguments for things like maintaining open trade regimes, maintaining open flows to international capital, pursuing appropriate macroeconomic policies and financial supervision and prudential regulation, those are policies that are supposed to be good because they're good for the nation, for the countries that are applying them to themselves. And so that is the sense in which pursuing policies that are virtuous from the global standpoint is generally its own reward at the national level. That's what a lot of economics actually teaches. Now, of course, this argument that domestically appropriate policies are also globally appropriate is subject to limitations having to do with problems with either market failures or problems having to do with income distribution. But those are things, market failures and redistributive issues are those that can also be, in some sense, could be solved through appropriate domestic policies of either redistribution or fixing those domestic market failures. So that's the sense in which well-governed countries, in other words, countries that are managing their economic and social affairs well, will generally tend to favor open economic policies. And those will, in fact, be policies that are relatively close to the global optimum. Now, this does not mean that countries don't make mistakes and that those mistakes will not affect other countries. Of course, they do make those mistakes. But for a lot of policy areas, when they do make those mistakes, in fact, it is the country itself that bears the bulk of the cost. So in some sense, these are policies of beggar thyself. So excessive trade protection, when you're giving in to import competing interests, we know from the theory of trade that it's largely domestic consumers that are going to pay the price. If you have subsidies that are misguided, that are not simply internalizing externalities, once again, you'll have inefficient resource allocation and the taxpayers will pay the price. If you have like bans on genetically modified foods that is not based on good science, once again, it's going to be domestic consumers that are going to be paying that price. Now, so these are all instances of bad policy that is not motivated by the purpose of harming other countries. It is bad policy because domestic governance failures. And here, it is not at all clear that international rules can actually reliably prevent such domestic governance failures. Now, in principle, international commitments, international rules can alleviate certain types of governance failures, domestic governance failures, such as probably the most well-known is time inconsistency. But just as well, of course, they can also, international rules can also empower vested interests and therefore actually aggravate governance failures. And I've written about this in other places about how many international rules, trade rules, for example, are really the product of sort of the international extension of lobbying by domestic firms such as big tech or pharmaceutical companies. So we cannot take for granted that just because we're moving the decision-making, the rule-making from the national to the international level, that the international level is going to be appropriately addressing governance failures at home and therefore produce better rules rather than actually aggravate or create additional governance failures. Now, we might in principle imagine international rules that would specifically address domestic political governance failures as opposed to addressing free trade and reducing transactions costs to trade and capital flows. But these would be difficult to design. And in any case, most existing global governance arrangements are not explicitly pursuing this objective. So, so I'm not going to go into the argument in some specific cases like subsidies about sort of whether in fact something like a subsidy, which in principle is a benefit, an export subsidy, which is a benefit to the rest of the world, whether that should be internationally governed or not, as currently it is. But there is no good good economic argument for it. I want to leave that aside, and I'm happy to answer a question. But I've made my main point, I think, as I have, which is that for most domains of economic policy, in fact, the argument for global rules or global governance is very weak, that well-governed domestic political systems will produce policies that are also close to being globally optimal. Now, there are two major exceptions to that, which is where, in fact, is the exceptions to that where we want global governance to focus on. And the two major exceptions where national and global interests do collide, I would put them under the headings of first, beggar thy neighbor policies, and second, global public goods or global public bads. And I think it's worth scrutinizing these a little bit because we will understand the relatively narrow remit of the argument for global rules and global governance. So three examples of beggar thy neighbor policies would be the classic optimum tariff argument, where you are essentially extracting rents from the rest of the world by monopolizing a product on world markets. A pure tax haven would be an example where you pursue very low corporate tax policies, not to attract physical investment, but essentially to attract paper headquarters, where you're essentially just stealing tax revenue from other countries. Competitive devaluations, where in a world with unemployment, by having a more competitive currency, you're getting more employment at the expense of less employment in your trade partners. Now, it's important to underscore that the sense in which I'm using the beggar thy neighbor concept is, this is not every policy that has an adverse or negative implications on the rest of the world. What makes a true beggar thy neighbor policy objectionable is not that it creates negative spillovers, but that the external harm, this negative spillover, is precisely the vehicle through which the domestic gains are created. In other words, there would not be domestic gains if there was not harm imposed on the rest of the world. So you would never have an incentive to impose a tariff if you're not in the process able to screw the rest of the world. You would not have a competitive evaluation if you were not stealing employment from the rest of the world. This is very different from many areas, such as subsidies, for example, or technical standards or GMOs, where you're doing things that are pursuing domestic policy objectives that might have byproduct adverse implications for the rest of the world. But the point is not to screw the rest of the world and derive benefit therefore. And that's why I think beggar thy neighbor policies in this strict sense are a particular exception. Now, so there are beggar thy neighbor policies, but the truth is there aren't that many of them. And I've put here the three that I can think of that come as close to being beggar thy neighbor. Then, of course, there's the large category of global public goods, where we know that we need global cooperation, that each nation going on its own will collectively drive us to climate hell or to very severe under-provision of global public health, research and information and so forth. But I would say that these global public goods, when you think of them, I cannot think of many in the economic domain. They apply mostly to non-economic areas such as climate change and global public health. So just to sort of clearly so sum up what I've said so far. So the global economy, despite what a lot of journalistic and popular discussion suggests, actually does not have the features of a global commons. That is that, actually leaving countries doing their own thing is not necessarily a bad thing for most areas of the government economy. And therefore, that in particular, we must distinguish between policy spillovers of various kinds, and that our focus should be really on policies that are in the domain of global public goods and strict beggar thy neighbor policies. There are actually few genuine beggar thy neighbor policies, and that most global economic failures, it's not that we don't fail, but when we fail, these true global economic failures, they arise mostly from failures of domestic governance, not lack of international rules or international governments. And with the implication that many domains, policy domains, in fact, many that are currently, that we try to regulate internationally are better left to national regulation. And where global safeguards might be limited, might be to sort of some procedural safeguards that if there are questions, I'm happy to talk about it. This also makes us think that when we think about global rules, we have to be very clear about what kind of global rules we're talking about. Too often when we talk about global governance, we're focusing on globalization enhancing global governance. That is global governance that's targeted at lowering barriers to trade. And when we do that, or to investment, we're often doing the bidding of very special interests themselves. Whereas in fact, the argument I've constructed right now would suggest that there's a much better argument, a much more robust argument for global governance that is focused on what one might call governance enhancing, that is procedural safeguards that might actually improve governance domestically. Now, that's an entirely different domain, but I would argue that the kind of globalization we would get from those kinds of rules would be very different from the kinds of rules that we've had under hyper-globalization system since the 1990s. So that leads me to sort of this first critical conclusion about the importance of global economic governance light is okay. That the kind of global rules we would want would essentially discipline strict beggar thy neighbor policies and would enforce rules for global public goods, would focus on areas that very clearly benefit all rather than a few. And here we would obviously want to focus on areas where the efficiency gains are very, very large rather than rather small. But otherwise really leaves considerable space for policy autonomy and institutional diversity across nations. Now, that is a key conclusion because, of course, many, if not most, of the economic tensions that arise in the relations between US and China have to do with, in fact, the significant differences in the economic structures and economic policies and institutions between those two nations. And of course, the more you imagine that you need to have a world of hyper-globalization, the more you will have to worry about those differences in institutional diversity. But I'm arguing that, in fact, those differences in policies and institutional landscapes are not an obstacle to having a healthy global economy. So from the perspective of U.S. economic relations and more broadly about economic globalization, I think we can talk about a world of peaceful economic coexistence, which would not put actually a lot of demand on international rules or international governments. In fact, this would be a world which would have rather permissive rules on subsidies, on intellectual property rights, on many types of industrial policies, which are a source of dispute between the U.S. and China. At the same time, however, so this is not just one way, carte blanche for China. The same way, it would allow a kind of an expanded set of safeguards for countries to uphold their own domestic labor, environmental, technological, and national security requirements. So it would be okay for the United States or Western Europe to keep out trade flows or investment flows that for which a good argument can be made. If they were allowed, they would undermine an important domestic regulatory or social objective. So there would be a good argument, for example, carbon border adjustment, taxes for carbon-intensive goods at the border, if there is a domestic decarbonization policy regime, but other countries, for example, China, does not have similar set of rules. In the same way, I think there would be strong arguments for having a strong anti-social dumping regime to allow countries to protect their domestic labor standards when such standards might be undermined by poor labor rights in exporting countries. And there might be similar trade and investment restrictions in response to genuine privacy or national security considerations. But what's important is that while I would accept the right of nations to protect their own standards and regulations and tax regimes by putting up barriers where necessary, I don't think there's an argument for why countries would use such measures in order to export their own standards. That's where I think sort of, the argument for why, we want to subject China to the same intellectual property rules or to our own conception of industrial policy or subsidies as prevails in the West. I think that argument falls through. I think, for example, taking the example of Huawei, I think it's perfectly okay for the United States to say, well, we don't want Huawei in the United States because we're concerned either on account of privacy or national security grounds about the integrity of our telecoms. But I don't think it's okay for the United States to impose that requirement on third countries, to go to European countries or to African nations and to say, you also have to keep out Huawei, because I think it's a judgment that each nation has to make on its own. And I think that's where it's important to make that distinction. So I think what I'm suggesting would essentially be a kind of a return to what I would think is the true spirit of Bretton Woods, and to what I understand by the true spirit of Bretton Woods. Let me use as my foil this time around a quote from Christine Lagarde, which I don't think gets the spirit of Bretton Woods right. And she said, Bretton Woods launched a new era of global economic cooperation in which countries help themselves by helping each other. I think, in fact, the truth was very much the opposite of this. I think the genius of the Bretton Woods regime was that it understood that by allowing countries to help themselves first, that is, by enlarging the space of policy autonomy relative to the globalization regime that had preceded it, and relative to the hyper-globalization that succeeded it, that in fact it made a healthy world economy or mutual cooperation more feasible. And therefore the success of the Bretton Woods regime, and indeed of any future global regime, I think might rest on the idea that countries help each other by ensuring that they're helping themselves first, because having healthy domestic economic social regimes is a precondition for helping, for having a healthy global economy that actually, going back to what I said before, well-regulated, well-governed economies and societies are much more likely to pursue open economic policies. Now, let me broaden this to questions about sort of the broader international political order. And here I want to sort of take these arguments and suggest that I don't think we need to move to a system of a rigid bipolarity or revive a different kind of a Cold War. That is a feasibility, that's a possibility, but I don't think it's necessary that a more benign world of coexistence more broadly beyond economic relations is possible. A world in which US and China would continue to compete on a large number of fronts, but I would also mutually have a mutually beneficial trade and investment relationship, would not challenge the legitimacy of each other's domestic systems. They would cooperate on major issues where their interests were aligned. But the important thing that they have to observe certain very broad rules of the road designed to make clash, a military conflict, much less likely. And I won't just spend the last few minutes on outlining what those rules of the road might be, building on the ideas that I've already talked about. So this is really about operationalizing this approach. So it's in this paper with Steve Walt, we present this as a kind of a meta regime. That it's a meta regime in the sense that it does not prescribe very specific rules. So it's not global governance in the sense of actually establishing a regime of precise rules in different domains. And it presumes actually only minimal initial agreement among the major powers. So it's essentially more of a device for structuring a conversation around the relevant issues and facilitating either agreement where there is such agreement or accommodation of differences where there is no agreement. And therefore, it's agnostic and open-ended about the specific rules that will be applied in particular issue areas. Really, the only sort of threshold condition for participation is that, let's say, US and China would agree on the desirability of here's a fourfold, but I really am going to talk about three different categories because I'm focusing on bilateral relationships. They would agree on the desirability of putting their different policy discussions in one of three different categories with different rules of the road for each one of them. So the category one would be actually policies or domains where there are clear agreements on prohibited actions. So these are actions that all parties would agree are illegitimate or wrong, or that contravene principles that are all willing to accept. So these would be actions that entail harms that are imposed on other states that could not be plausibly justified by economic or national security considerations of the state that causes them. Okay, so in principle, global public bads or clear beggar thy neighbor actions would fall into this category. Of course, they may not be ex ante agreed, but what's important is the understanding that you do not provide global public bads, you do not engage in strict beggar thy neighbor action. So there is actually a cost to pursuing policies in the understanding that this would be things under the category of prohibited actions. It's a conversation starter. It's a way of structuring the conversation. Now, to start with, the category one might be relatively empty, although there are many things like you don't start a nuclear war that one might want to put into the first category. In the category two would be policies that do not fit in the previous category because there is not sufficient agreement on whether the action in question is clearly illegitimate. For example, is clearly a policy of a beggar thy neighbor nature. But there might still be positive sum solutions that is possible. So if state A adopts a policy that is harmful to state B, the two parties may be able to negotiate a mutually beneficial bargain that still leaves both better off. And such a bargain, for example, might involve state B offering a concession in another domain in return for state A revoking the harmful policy. So this category would enable mutual adjustments or cooperative negotiations to achieve Pareto improving outcomes, even when there is not an agreement as to whether the original action in question was in a category 1 action or not. And really, in many ways, sort of the cutting edge of this framework really comes with category 3, which is the category where countries will actually take independent, autonomous action. And this is going to be the category where mutual negotiation, mutual adjustments proves impossible. And each state, therefore, resorts to its own autonomous action. But the key rule of the road here is that this has to be what lawyers call well-calibrated policy action. So what does that mean? It means that in this domain first, that each state would be actually free to adopt its own national action. And what well-calibrated means is that when these actions are actually responses to other states' behavior, that there should be a clear linkage between the damage done by the other side's policies and the remedy at home, so that the policy is actually in some clear way intended to mitigate the negative effects of the other country's policies. So one requirement is that there is a clear cause and effect link, that there was a kind of a clear linkage, and that there are sort of the response is commensurate to the alleged harm. In particular, this countervailing policy responses, sort of the response at home, should not be undertaken for the express purpose of punishing the other side or weakening in the long run. So it's not meant to punish, it's meant to protect, uphold, make sure that domestic economy or society is not harmed, not to impose corresponding harm on the other side. And finally, I think it's very important is that this policy reaction should also not be used as a pretext to retaliate in a different and unrelated domain. So this, I think this notion of issue linkage is good if it's used for Pareto superior accommodations, but if it is used to magnify and escalate, then I think that's really when we're going to be getting into trouble, okay? So this is really a way of just having a conversation and figuring out about sort of where policies fit in each, and then what kind of responses are legitimate or not. Of course, there's absolutely no reason to expect that states will start with acceptance as to where each policy belongs. But I think the conversation or the process of determining which issues belong where can serve a useful function as insofar as it encourages each government to explain their actions, to clarify their motives, to justify their decisions, so there's a better understanding of why things are being done. So I think this process helps prevent conflicts both sides would like to avoid. It also serves their longer term in this interest. And I would argue this kind of meta regime can eventually help bootstrap a level of cooperation that might not have occurred otherwise because of this process of explanation, motivation, justification, and trust building. Where agreement is not going to prove impossible, as will be often the case, then the meta regime will enhance communication among the parties and clarify the reasons for the disagreement. And I think it will, in the long run, has the potential of incentivizing states to avoid inflicting unnecessary harm on others as they act to protect their own interests, which I think we have to understand has to be a clear element of a stable global order, that states have the autonomy and the room within which they can protect their interests, but doing so in a way that does not create a security dilemma for the other countries, that doesn't escalate. And I think importantly, it does not impose costs, initial costs. It does not impose constraints on states that want to maintain this kind of freedom of action. So the downside is low. You're not buying into commitments ex ante. And I think that's the sense in which this also has a certain, this kind of meta regime, or this set of framework for structuring disagreements and conversations has some value. So this is largely this. I'll stop here. This is sort of my answer to this to the challenge or the gauntlet thrown at us economists by IR scholars and international relations and foreign policy scholars that tell us that there is this inexorable conflict. And I'd like to suggest that that there are ways we can actually overcome them. And so let me just stop here. Thank you.
Dani, thank you very much. This is highly important. Highly important. This is a fundamental contribution to the discussion of international relations as well as international economic framework, international governance, right? Really fundamental. Okay, so can I summarize the first part of your argument as the laissez-faire principle of international relations? That is, so long as individual countries know what they do for their own citizens, then in most times, on most issues, they will help other countries actually by helping themselves, right? What is eventually good for other countries actually is good for themselves, right? So I think this is fun. And then based on this I call maybe oversimplifying laissez-faire principle of international governance, you have your meta regime. Highly interesting. Now I encourage our audience to send in your questions, right? We already have one question, but before going to their questions, let me ask, let me give you, Dani, one observation, and then ask you one question. The one observation is very much in support of your laissez-faire principle. That is the case of China. If you look at the case of China, China has been super active, or I would even say aggressively, very aggressive in pursuing economic opening, to the extent that oftentimes that policy appears to have to be harming the Chinese economy on its own in the short run. For example, China is now applying to join CPTPP. China concluded a negotiation on investment with the European Union, although that agreement is not being legislated because of politics, right? So on both issues, CPTPP and the investment agreement, China has been doing things which is good for China in the long run, but harmful in the short run. So that goes into your argument. So because China knows in economic policies, knows what is good for its own country in the long run. Therefore, China is more than eager to open up its economy than most economies would anticipate. Okay, so that's my observation. I think your first principle applies very nicely to Chinese case. Now my question is this: if there are externalities across time, will your principles still work? Let me be more specific. In the case, let's take the case of Facebook, of Meta. Meta or Facebook is trying to become the monopoly of the virtual economy. So, okay, suppose this is the case. Meta is trying, or Facebook is trying to become the monopoly of the world. And the direct benefit of this monopoly will be the American investors, American people to a large extent. So So by helping the U.S. Company Meta, U.S. will gain benefit in the long run, which will hurt the rest of the world in the long run. So there's time inconsistency. What is good for the U.S. right now in helping Meta will be good for the U.S. in the long run, which will hurt the other economies. So there's time inconsistency because of the issue of platform competition. So how would you take that into account in your framework of laissez-faire international governance?
Yes, thanks, David, for that question. Now, how to deal with platform companies and the large digital monopolies that arise because of network and other scale effects is a tough question. So the question is I would say, from the standpoint of global governance, the first question I would ask is the time inconsistency here one that has a kind of a cross-border spillover effect? In other words, it's a that the costs are being borne in the long run by the rest of the world, but it's so from a national standpoint, the right policy, from a strictly national standpoint, the right national policy for the United States is to promote Meta and other similar digital Facebook, and where then it becomes a question of essentially a beggar thy neighbor policy, because it's really it's a policy of extracting grants from consumers in the rest of the world. And that I would say would fall under a beggar thy neighbor category. Now, if it's the case that, as I think is more likely to be the case, in fact, the time inconsistency problem is really one that, U.S. consumers are also going to be paying a price. So it's really a short-sighted policy of the U.S. government from the perspective of long-run U.S. national interest as well. Then it would fall under my category for sort of a failure of domestic governance, failure of national governance. And now the question is whether international rules can alleviate that. Given the kinds of uncertainty that exist, I would find it very hard to imagine a kind of a world system where, there is, impartial economists and lawyers are able to design global rules to ensure that, that the United States and other countries can appropriately regulate their digital platforms. I think that seems both very undemocratic and also not likely to end well. So that leads me to believe that to the conclusion that as a second best outcome, we're likely to see countries want to give up some of the benefits of network and scale economies in order to claw back some of the benefits of autonomous regulatory regimes, that is much more control over what some of these platforms can do. So, and in that world, we're going to have maybe, somewhat, different clouds, different platforms that are competing, that are maybe more regionally or nationally based. And maybe we give up some of the benefits of scale and network effects because there are, there are huge network effects from having one single Facebook, but that we have the benefits of individual nations being able to devise rules on privacy, on rules on other matters that are much more in line with their own conceptions of their national interests. So then it would be a world where, in fact, we give up some of the efficiencies of having, sort of platform, global platforms, but we get some of the benefits of regulatory diversity. And so that would be a world in which it's not a seamless world of complete globalization, but it's one that it's a world where economics necessarily accommodates the differences of interests and differences in conceptions of regulatory models. that exists in different national settings. In some ways, we're already heading there, right? I mean, China has its own, essentially its own platforms, and some of the, Yahoo, I read yesterday, is moving out of China. And so there is a certain kind of a certain regionalization and nationalization process that's already taking place. I don't view that necessarily as a very bad thing. I view that as a kind of a necessary accommodation to this world with different interests and with different needs.
Thank you very much, Danny. You also, in your answer, you also in your explanation also answered my other question, which is that oftentimes in reality, national governance failed, right? Oftentimes the national governance fails in countries like Africa, and you actually answered my question. That is, it's impossible to have international. It's very hard to have international governance to improve domestic governance, right? That's answer my question. Now, here's a question from our audience. Okay, this audience, thank you particularly for your insightful question. He learned a lot, and he would like to ask your opinion on China's rather unconventional practice in imposing capital control. He said capital control, right? China restricting capital control. And would you, according to your analysis, would you classify China's policy of capital control as a beggar thy neighbor policy? How would you characterize capital control?
I mean, first of all, I mean, no, I would not classify capital controls as beggar thy neighbor. If they have costs, the primary incidence of those costs would be on the national economy, because they would deprive domestic borrowers from access to international markets. They would deprive domestic savers from accessing investment vehicles in the rest of the world. So the primary costs are being borne at home. So I don't think of capital controls as something that's a sort of a beggar thy neighbor policy. And I think capital controls are not unorthodox. I mean, I think I think that's, they would be unorthodox only from the perspective of somebody who's lived only the last few decades. I mean, capital controls have very legitimate domestic reasons. The whole Bretton Woods regime was built on capital controls, as Keynes famously said. We need capital controls not as a temporary expedient until financial markets resume back to normalcy after the end of the Second World War, but as a permanent feature of a worldwide economic system that would enable that macroeconomic stability at home and would give domestic governments the space to conduct monetary and fiscal policies that are not at the whim of short-term capital flows in and out. So now that's completely separate as to what I think about the specifics of Chinese capital control policies, and I'm not, necessarily. I don't have authoritative views on that, but I just want to say that first, I don't consider capital control policies unorthodox, and I also don't think they're generally beggar thy neighbor.
Thank you, Danny. Okay, here's a question, a very thoughtful question. The question says that would you suggest, or would you agree that should try to interfere in Chinese media, try to, by, for example, setting up radio stations like Free Asia radio station around China, try in order to promote the U.S. ideal of freedom of media in China. In other words, whether you would regard the media freedom as something national government should be left on its own.
Yeah, that's an important question. And David, I should say that I have another meeting after this, so maybe this will be the last question that I take, with apologies. I take the issue of basic democratic liberties, civil liberties, and human rights, I think I take them very seriously. And I do believe that there are legitimate reasons why many Western governments are concerned about human rights practices in China. I do think, however, that the most effective ways of advancing universal human rights and civil liberties is by presenting a good example to the rest of the world. So I would hope that the United States and Europe would be beacons of good practices in democracy, civil liberties, human rights, free speech, and free media. And that's the way that they actually spread the message. I don't think it's very effective by setting up propaganda vehicles and setting up radio or TV stations. I doubt about the efficacy of that except for during special circumstances, special periods. So I would say that I think the most important thing for those who care about human rights is actually to ensure first that you're setting up a good example at home that people up to in other countries. And secondly, to the extent that you're concerned about human rights practices in China, what's happening in Xinjiang, so forth, there's an argument for not being complicit in those practices. But in other words, I think it's okay for the United States to restrict imports from operations where there's good evidence that there's use of repressed labor and so forth. But our ability of the United States or Europe to actually change those practices is very limited. So let's be true from the Western standpoint. I would say let's be true to our own values. Let's practice them. Let's also understand that there's very limited ability to export them, except for by being a good model.
Thank you very much, Professor Dani Rodrik from Harvard University Kennedy School of Government. Thank you for your insights, for wisdom, and for the audience, thank you very much for your participation. And we will edit this webinar into an article. You will before long find a way to access to this article. And again, thank you very much, and have a good day, Dani, and also good night to our audience in China. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David. It was good to talk to you. Bye-bye.